Hey everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'd first like to just ask if anyone needs interpretation for Spanish for this meeting. You can just please click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. That will take you to a separate room for Spanish, and you'll hear a simultaneous interpretation of the session. We'll just wait a couple moments here. Okay, great. We're going to get started. So my name is Chelsea Kelly. I'm the Deputy Director of the Planning and Land Use Division of the New York City Council. We're here with council members from the Bronx delegation who wanted to make sure that information about the important proposal, the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity by the Department of City Planning is available to the people of the Bronx. So a couple of things. We're going to have some welcome remarks from our council members in the Bronx delegation. Then we're going to move into, or we're going to have some remarks also from the director of the Bronx office of the Department of City Planning. Then the Department of City Planning, or DCP, is going to go into their presentation, which is basic info on the City of Yes proposal. And then we'll move into a Q&A session. So people should feel free to submit questions in the Q&A function at any time during the evening, and we'll get to those during the Q&A session. We've also received some questions already by email, so we'll have those ready to go as well. One other note is that, we know that there's another big project coming to the Bronx Metro North area study rezoning. That's a separate application. It's currently in public review. I just wanted to make it super clear that this is a separate proposal and there's going to be lots of opportunities to talk about Bronx Metro North. So I just want to encourage folks to make sure that we're responding to this particular proposal and saving our questions for Bronx Metro North for other venues. So with that, I will kick it over to our Bronx delegation co-chair, Althea Stevens. Councilmember Stevens.
Hello, good evening, and welcome everyone. I'm so happy to see that so many people are jumping on to this important conversation. I'm Councilmember Althea Stevens of District 16 in the West Bronx. I am the co-delegation chair, and my co-delegation chair on here is also on here, Eric Zinowitz, and he'll be speaking right after me. But I just wanted to just make sure I stopped in, and I believe we have Councilmember Riley on as well, who's also the chair of land use subcommittee. I don't know. Anyway, he's also here as well. But, we really wanted, as a Bronx delegation, wanted to make sure that we were bringing this information to everyone. We do know that there's been presentations done at the community board, but the City of Yes is a plan, and the housing one specifically is a plan that's going to affect each and every one of us throughout the city. So it is important that you guys have the right information so that you can help us make the decision, right? And just thinking about, I say this all the time, that I represent folks. And so what that means is we need to also get your input. And the only way I can get your input if you have the information to give me the input of what you think and how we should move forward. And so, please ask all the questions that you need to ask. And if you have additional questions after the presentation is over, please feel free to reach out to my office if you're in District 16, so we can talk about any concerns, anything that you're happy about, changes that you want to see. Really want to make sure that this process is open and get your feedback so that I can make the best decision when I go into make the decision around voting. So thank you all for showing up here today. The Bronx is really excited about this, and this is really what we want to see, people being a part of the conversation and being participants. So thank you all for coming here tonight. And I'll pass it over to Councilmember Dinowitz.
Thank you, Co-Chair Stevens. I'm really excited about the presentation. I think what Althea, Councilmember Stevens said is absolutely correct. We have almost 100 participants on this Zoom, which I think is really important for making sure that we as a Bronx have our voice heard. The DCP is going to present their proposal for increasing housing, really, as Councilmember Stevens says, everywhere in the city. A lot of people agree that more housing needs to be built. This is their proposal. The really important point is for you to listen, but to make sure that you are reaching out to us, to your Bronx council members, to make sure we know your concerns or the things you support in this presentation, because it is going to go through a process where at some point we are going to vote on this. And we in the Bronx delegation believe deeply in making sure that your voices are heard. And so I appreciate every single one of you who is on, everyone who's watching on some other media like Bronx News 12 or BronxNet. I do also want to shout out Christy Marmorato, who is on this call as well. And I want to thank the City Council, Land Use, and DCP for this presentation. A number of you have already reached out to me, to my office, and we have forwarded those questions to the presenters. So those questions should be answered throughout the presentation. But if they haven't been, I believe there is a Q&A function in this chat. So make sure that you are asking every single question you want to ask, and you are reaching out to our offices to make sure your opinion is known to us. Thank you.
Also wanted to just shout out, we do have Councilmember Salamanca, who's also on the call, who is the land use chair, who's very important in this process as well. I'm not sure if him or Kevin wanted to say some words as well.
I'll just say a few words. Thank you, Councilmember Stevens. Good evening, everyone. Just wanted to thank the land use team for putting this together. The land use team from the City Council will be present, taking all your recommendations and also your suggestions, and we're going to use that as a cookie cutter while we negotiate how the City of Yes, the housing component, is put together. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Chelsea. Thank you.
Great. And Councilmember Riley, who's also our chair of the Subcommittee on Zoning and Franchises, who also plays a significant role in our city's land use process.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chelsea. And thank you to the co-chairs of the delegation, Chair Salamanca. I think we all know how important it is to produce more housing, more new units within our community. So really, really excited to hear from our community and make sure that they have a voice within this process. I want to give a special thanks to the land use team and to DCP. I see Paul Phillips on the line, who has been a tremendous partner within the Bronx office. So just want to salute you guys and looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, council members. And we will now kick it over to Paul Phillips, who's the director of the Bronx office at the Department of City Planning, for some remarks.
Thank you, Chelsea. Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Phillips. I'm the borough director here at the Bronx office of the Department of City Planning. And I'm thrilled to be with you this evening to talk about City of Yes for housing opportunity. Before we begin the presentation, I want to give a huge thanks to our Bronx delegation for organizing this important information session. Council members Althea Stevens, Eric Dinowitz, Rafael Salamanca, and Kevin Riley. Public forums like this are extremely important to the planning process, and appreciate you making this happen. I also want to say a few words about why we're here today and why this conversation is so important. To put it simply, New York City has a housing shortage, and it's making housing expensive and hard to find. Over the last decade, we created about 800,000 jobs, but only 200,000 homes. The vacancy rate for rental apartments is down to 1.4%. The vacancy rate for units under $1,500 a month is functionally at zero. Over 50% of New Yorkers are rent burdened, which means that they pay more than 30% of their income in rent. And in many neighborhoods like Mott Haven or Bedford Park, here in the Bronx, those percentages are even higher. One reason New York City doesn't have enough housing: outdated and complicated zoning laws have limited new housing production. And the new housing that has been built, too much of it is concentrated in just a few areas of the city. We need to take action to fix this housing crisis. And that's what we're aiming to do with City of Yes for Housing Opportunity. By adjusting those restrictive, complicated zoning rules, we want to make it possible to build a little more housing in every neighborhood so that New Yorkers have more housing choices. There are a couple of key things about the plan that I would like to point out. This is a citywide plan about building a little more housing in every neighborhood, not just in the borough of the Bronx. The plan is about adding housing in careful ways that won't disrupt the character of our neighborhoods. For example, modest apartment buildings near transit or above retail. Small accessory dwelling units that give homeowners a financial lifeline. Office conversions that turn underused space into much needed homes, or extra income restricted affordable housing in high cost areas. So this evening, we're absolutely going to be talking about what City of Yes for Housing Opportunity would look like in the Bronx and what parts of the proposal would apply where. But I want to emphasize that this plan does not ask the Bronx to do everything. It's about taking a balanced, citywide approach, about making a big impact on the overall housing shortage without dramatic changes in any one neighborhood or in any borough. Finally, I want to quickly say, these are important issues. They are complex, and we really value everyone's input. DCP has been running a monthly housing opportunity information session series since February, and we look forward to continuing the conversation at community events just like this, and soon enough with community boards across the city. Thank you for your time, and now we'll turn it back over to my colleagues.
Great, and I'll just quickly just mention, in case folks missed it at the top of the meeting, we do have Spanish interpretation this evening. Please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen, and you'll be taken to a separate room for interpretation. We will have a Q&A section at the end of this DCP's presentation, which we're about to get into. So please use that Q&A function to drop your questions in. And one last thing is about the Bronx Metro North study rezoning. That is a different rezoning. That is a rezoning. It's different. It is a neighborhood rezoning. Please focus your questions on this particular proposal so that we can have a productive session. So let's kick it over to those presenting for the DCP presentation.
Great, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. We're really excited to have this opportunity to talk to you about our City of Yes for Housing Opportunity. It is a citywide text amendment that will change zoning to allow for equitable housing development. Next slide, please. So this text amendment will enable the creation of a little more housing in every neighborhood by removing the layers of exclusionary zoning that have created barriers to housing growth. And this proposal will update zoning to better meet the needs of today's New Yorkers. The idea is if every neighborhood from our highest density to the lowest density areas can add a little more housing, New York City can add a lot more housing overall without any single neighborhood experiencing dramatic changes over tax infrastructure. One note before we get started in tonight's conversation, throughout this presentation, you will see maps showing how various City of Yes for Housing Opportunity proposals will work in different parts of the Bronx. That said, this is a citywide plan, and these proposals would apply in other boroughs as well. Next slide, please. So New York City has seen tremendous job growth over the last 2 decades, but housing production has not kept pace with the city's growing population. Increasingly restrictive zoning rules have limited housing production, making it difficult and expensive to build homes. The little housing growth that has happened, particularly new affordable housing, has been concentrated in relatively few neighborhoods. And this has led us to a city of historically low vacancy rates of 1.4%. In the Bronx, the vacancy rate is even lower, less than 1%. Next slide, please. So proposals we're talking about today, they emerge directly from the goals that are outlined in our city's Fair Housing Plan, Where We Live NYC. And this created by Housing Preservation and Development, or HPD, in collaboration of over 250 community organizations. And our Fair Housing Plan highlights how our city's housing shortage and affordability crisis have severely limited New Yorkers' housing choices. In a tight housing market, landlords can charge high rents, and existing tenants are vulnerable to tenant harassment, poor housing quality, and displacement pressure as they are outbid for units. Not having enough homes is also a direct cause of homelessness. All this further worsens the neighborhood-based legacies of segregation, discrimination, and concentrated poverty that have led to the deeply unequal city that we have today, where neighborhoods have unequal access to resources and opportunities. Next slide. By updating our zoning, we can respond to these issues by increasing the number and types of homes available for a range of incomes in every neighborhood across the city. Again, if every neighborhood from our highest density to the lowest density can add a little more housing, New York City can see a lot more housing without any single neighborhood experiencing dramatic changes or overtaxed infrastructure. And a little more housing also has other big picture benefits for New York, including bolstering the local economy and supporting the environment. And this complements the other two City of Yes text amendments that people are likely familiar with, City of Yes for economic opportunity and City of Yes for carbon neutrality. Next slide. So City of Yes for housing opportunity is a text amendment, and it's the biggest pro-housing change that DCP has ever undertaken. And we'll be touching the zoning for every single part of the city so that no one area is taking it on alone. Some of our major proposals include the Universal Affordability Preference, or UAP for short, and this will allow for bigger buildings for affordable and supportive housing in every medium and high density zone district. Across the city, we're also proposing removing residential parking mandates, which are making building housing more expensive. We're also enabling more missing middle housing, and that refers to low-rise apartment buildings in our low-density areas. We're doing this through town center zoning in our commercial corridors and transit-oriented development in highly transit-accessible areas. We're also aiming to help homeowners in our low-density neighborhoods by creating an accessory dwelling unit program, or an ADU program, providing small buildings of additional flexibility under the zoning to adapt over time. There's also a range of smaller proposals that I'll discuss at the end that will enable a few important housing projects that can help bring New Yorkers the housing that they need. And these proposals include enabling the conversion of non-residential buildings, allowing small and shared apartments in central locations, and allowing for residential campuses to add height-limited buildings if they choose. Next slide. And this map just shows for the Bronx specifically where exactly those low density and medium high density districts are. So again, relatively a mix of low density and medium high density in the Bronx. Next slide. So before we provide additional detail about the low density proposals, just want to provide a little background about these areas. So this is the first time in decades that city planning is making significant zoning changes aimed at introducing new housing opportunities in these neighborhoods. And we've undertaken detailed research to inform our proposals for the city's single family, two family, and low density multifamily districts. And what we found is that exclusionary zoning rules have effectively allowed many low density neighborhoods to opt out of addressing the city's housing needs. And that in turn has put additional pressure on the high density parts of the city to produce more and more housing. This wasn't always the case though. Many of these restrictive rules were layered on in the 1990s and early 2000s. This means that low density areas actually have many buildings that would be illegal to build today. Small apartment buildings like the one pictured on this slide here define our low density areas, but all zoning allows you to build is a single family home. There are 18 different low density zone districts, and 12 of them claim that they allow you to build a two family home or a low density multifamily building. As you can see from the darker blue sections on this map, these areas are the majority of our low density districts. But these districts become two family or multifamily in name only. If you were to actually try to build a building that had more than one unit in most of these districts, you wouldn't be able to do it. The parking requirements are so high you couldn't physically fit both the building and the parking, for example, or the yard requirements are so extreme that the building's footprint wouldn't accommodate multiple units. This purposefully confusing zoning is plainly exclusionary. We recognize that and aim to peel back that exclusionary zoning through our proposals. We also want to reintroduce housing types to these areas that can accommodate affordable housing, both modest buildings that are more naturally affordable than other types of construction, and apartment buildings at a scale that can take advantage of existing affordability programs. Next slide. And this slide just shows a map breaking down further detail for the low density areas in the Bronx. Again, there's a mix of the single family, two family, and low density multifamily districts. Next slide. So one of our most exciting proposals is to re-legalize missing middle housing in low density areas. And again, this housing is called missing middle, both because of its physical scale and because it tends to serve middle income residents, since it's relatively affordable to build. So we want to allow for these low-rise apartment buildings on a variety of sites that we think make sense based on the existing architecture in low-density neighborhoods. So first, we want to foster town centers in the low-density areas by allowing for buildings that have ground floor commercial uses to build 3 to 4 floors of housing on top, which is what is being illustrated in this animation right now. About 5 square miles of the city is zoned to allow for low-density mixed-use buildings. But if someone in these areas wanted to build a mixed-use building, there's almost no way they could do it. Height and floor area limits are lower than what is realistically necessary for this type of building, and parking requirements, again, are very high. So we're proposing adjustments to the zoning to make this type of mixed-use building feasible where the zoning map already allows it. And this will enable a kind of development that matches what's already in many of New York City's low-density neighborhoods, better than the single-story commercial storefronts that are common on these blocks today. And on the next slide, you'll see a map showing where exactly there are these low-density commercial overlays in the Bronx. Next slide. So next, we want to promote transit-oriented development in the low-density districts. So DCP is proposing a new geography that extends past our existing transit zone and identifies areas that have good access to transit. And you can see the low-density districts in purple that fall into this area on the map. So large sites that are in this area and are also located on a wide street or on the short end of the block, we have to build a low-rise apartment building, 3 to 5 stories, depending on the height limits of the underlying district. And this kind of transit-oriented development mirrors the existing context. It's common in low-density neighborhoods to see a small apartment building on a corner with single or two-family homes mid-block, like what's being shown in this image. Transit-oriented development also advances fair housing by encouraging a little bit of housing in every neighborhood and sustainable development near transit. Next slide. And this map shows for areas in the Bronx where those low density residence districts that fall within the new greater transit oriented development area. Next slide. So in the rest of the low density areas, we want to give homeowners flexibility. Under this proposal, a single or two family home will be allowed to add a small accessory dwelling unit or an ADU. There are a range of types of ADUs, including backyard cottages, garage conversions, and basement apartments. And these small units provide important housing options for small households, like a young person moving to their own place for the first time, or an elderly resident who wants to age in place. Because of their small size, they also serve different income levels than a large single-family home does. Other state successful implementation of ADU programs show us that these units can give multi-generational families a little more space and help middle-class homeowners with household expenses. Many of the barriers to legalizing existing units, such as basement apartments, are in state and local laws other than zoning, but we are doing what we can to enable the safe legalization of those units as well. Next slide. And this just shows a sample single or two-family home in the Bronx. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, go back one slide. So the same rule changes that enable ADUs can also help homeowners who don't want to add an ADU, but just want a little more flexibility to adapt their homes to meet their needs. So our research shows us that many existing buildings are out of compliance with today's zoning rules. For example, R41 districts are two-family districts that allow for semi-detached buildings like the one pictured here. But buildings like these pre-1961 duplexes could not be built today because they have more square footage than what we currently allow, as well as a smaller rear yard. And these zoning noncompliances can cause big headaches for homeowners if they need to borrow money from the bank or if they want to make simple changes to their home, like renovating an outdated kitchen. So we just want to update these rules, and that'll have two benefits. First, homeowners of existing buildings won't run into issues when they go to make an alteration to their building because the zoning will better match what's actually on the ground. Second, you actually be able to build a two-family home in a two-family district or a multifamily home in a multifamily district, when today the only thing that would be feasible is a single-family home. Next slide. So next, we're going to turn our attention to the medium high density areas of New York City. And our focus here is creating more opportunities for housing, including affordable housing. So the Universal Affordability Preference, or UAP, is one of our big moves in medium and high density areas. So under our current zoning, each zoning district gets the same FAR, or the amount of square feet you're allowed to build, regardless of whether you're building market rate or affordable housing. But there is an exception. If you're building affordable senior housing, you get more FAR, meaning you're allowed to build a bigger building. We want to take that existing preference for senior housing and extend it to all types of affordable and supportive housing. This means that the FAR for market rate housing won't change, but you'd be allowed to build at least 20% more so long as that extra room is occupied by affordable housing. There are a few districts that don't have that senior housing preference today, shown in dark orange on this map here. So we'll be creating new FARs for those districts to enable housing in every neighborhood. We also want to make sure you're actually allowed to build a building that fits the square footage you're allowed to provide height increases in places where you need an extra story or so to actually fit that affordable housing. DCP is still working with HPD to determine the exact affordability levels for UAP, but this framework will achieve deeper affordability levels than existing programs like voluntary inclusionary housing, or VIH, to serve lower income New Yorkers. Affordability levels are set through income measures set by the federal government called Area Median Income, or AMI. And the AMI for UAP would be lower than 80%, where the affordability level currently is for VIH. We recognize this doesn't meet the needs of New Yorkers who need affordable housing, especially as AMIs have risen dramatically in recent years. For example, in 2019, 80% AMI for a family of three was around $76,000, but today it's over $100,000, far higher than the incomes of many working New Yorkers. So the UAP will use lower AMIs than 80%. Additionally, to ensure that UAP can reach a broader range of households, UAP will allow for income averaging, meaning a building can include deeply affordable units and serve a much wider range of New York City families. Next slide.
One moment, please. I think we just lost our signal to our slides. Just hold on 1 second. Apologies for technical difficulties. Okay, so we'll get back into the universal affordability preference.
Before going into the details of that, I just want to also show a map of the Bronx and where exactly which districts have that existing senior housing preference today. So primarily, most of them already have an existing senior housing preference, and there are a few districts that would have those new FARs, which would have at least 20% more to include that preference for affordable and supportive housing. So here I'll just walk through an example of how universal affordability preference works. So let's say we have this church located in R6 district that wants to build affordable housing. Today they get 3.0 FAR, regardless of whether developing market rate or affordable. And for this site, that'll get them about 35 units. Under the UAP framework, they get up to 3.9 FAR, but note that extra 0.9 FAR could only be used for affordable housing. If it is, they can build about 10 to 12 more affordable units. Now, 10 to 12 more affordable units may not sound like a lot, but this is functioning at a citywide scale. If every project has a few more affordable units, we can add a significant amount of affordable housing, and no single neighborhood will experience drastic changes. So this is a visual representation of how UAP will play out. So without UAP, the building is built according to the base FAR for market rate housing. The result is this 8-story apartment building. With UAP, the building can be at least 20% bigger, which for this example translates to an additional 2 stories, so long as that difference is permanently affordable housing. In our initial calculations, we found that had UAP been in place since 2014, an additional 20,000 income-restricted affordable homes have been created and housed up to 50,000 New Yorkers. Finally, I will present our parking proposals. Our parking mandate changes is one of our big moves. We'll be making parking optional for new housing everywhere. Current parking mandates are bulky and burdensome, forcing a costly parking supply where it may not be strictly necessary, and at the expense of housing production, since developers may underbuild to avoid triggering high and costly parking requirements. And the image on this slide just shows how parking takes up a lot of space. 2 parking spaces equivalent size of this studio apartment, for example. And building parking itself is also expensive and an obstacle to housing growth, particularly affordable housing. So we want to prioritize housing over parking. At the same time, we want to underscore parking will still be allowed. And we anticipate that developers will respond to market needs and continue to provide parking in areas where there is that demand. Through removing parking mandates, we can help reduce the cost of housing construction and enable the development of more homes in each new building. So I'll just walk through an example of how eliminating parking mandates can support housing growth. So let's say you have a developer who sees this underutilized lot that's in a great location near a train and wants to convert the lot into an apartment building. So this lot could accommodate 16 units, but the developer stops at just 10 so they can waive out of the parking requirements. As soon as they add that 11th unit, they'll need to provide 6 parking spaces. By eliminating parking mandates, developer can now fully build out this lot to include those 6 additional units. Now again, 6 additional apartments may not seem significant, but when hundreds of sites across the city are able to build more housing, that incremental change results in a lot more housing available to New Yorkers. So while not as major as the ones I just discussed, there are a few other proposals that will enable some important projects and provide for a range of housing types. So you want to enable conversions of underused buildings by extending existing adaptive reuse regulations to more parts of the city and buildings that are built more recently. So first, we want to expand these regulations citywide to go beyond office districts to reach a broader range of buildings like vacant schools or former religious buildings. Secondly, we want to move the eligibility cutoff date from 1961 or 1977 to a uniform 1990 to reach a more recent set of vacant and underutilized buildings. Third, we want to enable conversions to all types of housing, including supportive housing, shared housing, and dormitories. For the second proposal in this suite, we also want to allow for small and shared apartments through eliminating the dwelling unit factor, which regulates minimum average unit size in our transit zone. Again, areas that have good access to transit. And we think that could help to serve marginally housed New Yorkers or others who want to live alone in a studio apartment. Today, a lot of folks who want to live alone have to find roommates in order to afford rent and take up family-sized units in many parts of the city. by enabling more small and shared apartments can relieve some of the pressure on those family size units. For the last proposal in this suite, we want finally, previous development often took place under tower in the park style regulations. Although we've developed a more recent set of regulations that have built-in height limits and result in better design, more contextual buildings, some sites like campuses and regularly shaped lots can't access those new rules. So we just want to extend allowances, enable height limited infill on sites that would otherwise be forced to develop tall, skinny buildings or nothing at all. Altogether, the suite of zoning changes I discussed will help result in equitable and sustainable housing development. There will be more housing added across the entire city so that every neighborhood does its part to address our housing needs, and a few neighborhoods don't have to feel the intense pressure that they do today. It's not just about more housing, though, it's also about more types of housing. Multifamily housing, where it's currently not allowed because of exclusionary zoning, units of different sizes to meet different people's needs, and crucially, far more affordable and supportive housing. So thanks so much for joining us for tonight's info session. We do have one more info session coming up in a few weeks on April 17th that provide a similar overview of the entire proposal for City of Esther housing opportunity in greater detail. So we definitely encourage folks to attend that one as well. I know we've gotten some questions already in the chat and email, so we'll start answering those shortly, but definitely encourage anyone to continue submitting their questions and taking this opportunity. And you can also visit our website at nyc.gov/yes housing opportunity, where you can find more information about upcoming info sessions and meetings as well. With that, I'll turn it over to Lara.
Thank you, Winnie. Thank you very much for that great presentation, and we're excited to start answering some of your questions. As a reminder, please use the Q&A function to type in your question, and we will get to as many as we can. We have some really good ones here. I first want to bring back up team members from the Department of City Planning. We have Winnie, Paul, and who you both have heard from already, and then John Mangan, who is leading our housing division, who are here to answer questions. And if you have questions for the council itself, of course, you have the council land use with us as well. You met Chelsea at the beginning of the hour. So let's dive right in. We're going to start off with a question from John in City Island. It seems like planners behind the mayor's proposal are not able to accept the legitimacy of zoning rules and regulations that came before the city of Yes. It is as if they actually believe that the way the rules have been applied have been a little haphazard or inorganic. Please help us to understand what is it specifically about the current zoning rules and regulations that is so problematic that only the wholesale changes proposed here will suffice going forward. Is there any evidence of this working?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, John. So a lot of our current zoning and the current iteration of our zoning resolution was added in 1961, and that was roughly 60 years ago almost. And in some cases, that's just disconnected with the built context. And we recognize that under previous administrations that city planning worked with neighborhoods to rezone their neighborhoods and map contextual districts. But cities planning's thinking about those actions have changed with time. We recognize the importance of urban design and neighborhood character. We also recognize that our past actions had a chilling effect on housing production. One fact about, for example, in 2022 housing production, there was 9 community districts that produced as much housing as the other remaining 50. Frankly, if we want to address our housing crisis face on, we need for every community district to do its part to produce housing. So our low density proposals that I discussed today will update our zoning to better match what's on the ground. For example, around 20% of the housing stock in single and 2 family districts come from buildings with more units that can be built today. And our high density proposals will allow for more affordable and supportive housing that everyone, I'm sure, in this space recognizes as an urgent need for New Yorkers. And citywide proposals like making parking optional and facilitating more conversions of non-residential buildings to housing also helps remove barriers to housing growth and put underused buildings to better use. Just so overall, the City Yes for Housing Opportunity proposals are just aiming to update that outdated zoning to promote incremental housing growth at a citywide scale.
Thank you, Winnie. So there's a couple people who asked similar questions. So I'm gonna lump these together. And the question is around, the City of Yes proposal will change the local communities at the expense of like deep-pocketed developers, and how will this actually impact the community engagement, the community board process? So if you could speak a little bit towards that, about like how this is proposal is going to help housing.
Yeah, definitely. So again, the City of Yes for Housing Opportunities is focused on allowing for a little more housing in every neighborhood, recognizing this currently our restrictive zoning has forced only a small handful of neighborhoods to bear most of our housing growth. So moving forward, if we want to make sure that people can stay in New York City and their children can stay in New York City, want to update the zoning to allow for more housing growth throughout the entire city. But at the same time, we're not changing any, zoning designations, any sites, like any zoning map changes. Like this isn't a neighborhood rezoning. We're just making minor adjustments to underlying regulations to facilitate a little more housing in neighborhoods across the city. And as folks are probably aware, especially if you're sitting on your community boards, the proposal will receive full public and environmental review, including hearings at all of the community boards, the commission, and council. And any zoning map changes or private applications will continue to require full public and environmental review, as they currently are through the Uniform Land Use Review procedure.
Thank you, Winnie. That's really helpful clarification. So the next question is a little bit about just extending onto what you just said about the little bit more housing and a little bit more adjustments to our zoning. Can you provide the projected build-out breakdown in each council district by each text? I know we're still working on the text, but could you provide just like sorry, the page is jumping. If people can stop moving the questions, that'd be really helpful to me. It is 1%. So the question, I'm sorry, let's go back to that one. There's a little bit about terminology and how it works. When we say a little bit more housing, is that intentional, or is there someone who can exactly talk to about the specifics of every neighborhood? This person's asking, can we project, is it going to be 1% more of parts of the Bronx or 2% more of the Queens? Just a little bit of understanding how that will work out, and how is it written in the legislation?
Yeah, great question. We definitely say a little more housing in every neighborhood, so totally understand wanting more detail and clarification about what exactly a little more housing means. So as part of the Housing Opportunity Tax Amendment process, we will be producing a really expansive environmental review document, environmental impact statement, or an EIS for short. And in the EIS, we have developed a new methodology for how exactly we can determine like rough estimates, how many units of housing each proposal that we talked about today will produce. So we've worked with a model about what determine the potential for development citywide, using a bunch of assumptions and information about the housing market for roughly what may occur by 2040. And this is represented by a low and a high estimate potential housing units based on like moderate or strong future housing market, respectively. So we're using those estimates to analyze potential environmental effects of the proposal at the neighborhood level. There will be a draft version of the EIS published on DCP's website in the coming weeks, so that will provide greater detail for exactly what a little more housing might mean for your particular neighborhoods.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to move down to question that for the City of Yes and housing opportunities in each council district, borough, and citywide, what is the projected increase in impervious surfaces from existing conditions to the full build out of housing units built? How does this change the city's ability to meet its 2030 climate change goals? Provide the alternative analysis or another way to accomplish the state's purpose and the need of the current housing proposal? And in other words, what other alternatives did you study to choose the least environmental impact to meet our 2030 climate change goals?
Yeah, great question, and gives me an opportunity to talk about one of the other City of Yes text amendments. So as we might have mentioned, City of Yes for Housing Opportunity is one of 3 citywide text amendments. It is the last to go through this process. The first one, City of Yes for Carbon Neutrality, most directly speaks to your question for how city planning is working to update our zoning to meet our climate goals. Recognizing that we are in a climate crisis and there's a lot of coastline in New York City. So for City of Yes for Carbon Neutrality, it does talk about how to update our zoning to meet those climate goals, particularly our goal of reducing our carbon emissions by 80% by 2050. For example, the energy used in our city's housing stock contributes to almost 70% of our city's greenhouse gas emissions. We have very old buildings here in New York City. And some of the challenges to updating and retrofitting our old buildings to better meet higher energy efficiency standards. One of those barriers comes from our zoning. So City of Yes for Carbon Neutrality work to update our zoning to make zoning not a barrier to actually making sure that our existing building stock can meet those higher energy efficiency standards. As for permeable surfaces specifically, carbon neutrality actually also updated the zoning to make it clear that permeable paving surfaces are always allowed. Previously, it was unclear if that was permitted, and whenever applicants wanted to use permeable paving surfaces, it involved a lot of back and forth with the Department of Buildings when they were applying for those job permits. So carbon neutrality helped clean up the text to ensure that that type of green and sustainable construction is allowed and very transparent.
And I want to, sorry, John Mangan from Housing Division, just take a step back as well and say that for those of us who care about climate change and meeting our carbon goals, the absolute best thing you can do for carbon intensivity is to build more housing in places like New York City with amazing access to jobs and transit. You know, we have better access to those things than almost anywhere in the country. And consequently, people who live here emit less carbon per capita than anywhere else in the country. So we think of building more housing in places like New York City as just, you know, even though we don't say it as much as some of the other goals related to housing affordability or housing opportunity, it's a really important aspect of what we're doing as well. More housing in New York City is the best way to address some of our climate goals. Sorry for butting in there. Thanks.
No, thank you for that, Ed, John. This one kind of, I think you kind of answered mostly, but I just wanted to make sure that we at least acknowledge it. This was a question about, in light of increasing rain events and proposed increase in impervious surfaces, there is a question about sewers and water infrastructure. Such studies and projections are essential in order to mitigate increased flooding, erosion, raw sewage backup. So I think you've answered that, but if there's other things that you would want to add, I just wanted to make sure I acknowledge the question.
Yeah, definitely. So again, the Housing Opportunity Text Amendment is designed to enable more housing across the widest possible geography rather than just focusing a lot of new housing construction in one particular neighborhood. So we don't expect the type of pressure on local infrastructure that can result from dramatic increases in a single area. That said, like we mentioned, we're going to be doing a very comprehensive environmental review to assess everything from sewage to school capacity. And we are working closely with the city's capital agencies to make sure capital investment goes where it's needed. And at the same time, big city actions like this are often the best opportunity to assess infrastructure capacity through a citywide lens.
Great. Okay, so the next question, how does the text change the proposal for the City of Yes for Economic Opportunity trigger interact or enable sections of the City of Housing for a Housing Opportunity? Based on the above questions that were asked, specifically explain the relationship between campus proposal and economic, the infill proposal and housing, and the green fast track for housing, aside from NYCHA, what other housing types will be changed in the campus infill?
Yes, great question. So for economic opportunities, campus proposal, and that's focused about creating a process in our zoning to allow for commercial uses on campus sites that currently allow only for residential uses. So economic opportunity creates an authorization subject to environmental review and community board approval to allow for campus sites to add a commercial space, like a local retail store or makerspace, for example. While housing opportunities campus proposal is focused on allowing for more infill development on campus sites that currently cannot add housing, or it's very challenging to add housing to the site because of our current zoning. And also want to underscore here, campus sites apply to more than just NYCHA, also includes privately owned residential campuses as well. And for the Green Fast Track, that is focused on streamlining the environmental review process and making it easier to build modest, eco-friendly residential buildings that are on like a smaller scale. So hopefully that provides clarity for how those three different proposals work and how they might interact and support each other.
Great. Thank you so much, Winnie. So this question is, why is DCP focused on City of Housing tonight before the DEIS or the zoning text or public review has been started?
Yeah, great question. We are hoping to use this opportunity to get feedback from Bronx residents, as well as an avenue to share more information about the proposals. We want to ensure no one is surprised by the text amendment. And we've done a lot of meetings with individual community boards, community organizations, and we're going to be doing a lot of individual meetings with community boards coming up. So we just want to ensure that everyone who is interested in housing in New York City, who has an opinion about housing in New York City, has an opportunity to learn about our proposals in advance before draft text is released and before we get into the process of actually doing public review. And we're going to keep having these meetings as much as we have the staff capacity to do so.
Yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to say, like, it's really incredible how much time has gone into this. We've done many info sessions. We really hope that you'll attend the next one as well. And the text will be released prior to public review, which is also ULURP. So, which many of you know as ULURP, but this is a within the public review process. So you will have that information and be able to review it and start thinking about questions and things as we get into the public review process. So I'm going to go to the next question that is around parking requirements. Eliminating parking requirements for new residential development ignores the necessity of car ownership in the outer boroughs and will strike a severe blow to the quality of life. Wondering, and the question is, please explain future actions in item 3.2 of the draft scope of work. You might not have that in front of you, but it's called the create discretionary action to remove parking requirements for existing buildings in all residence districts. No effect until discretionary action is sought and analyzed at a future date. Could you talk a little bit just about the parking requirement that is being proposed?
Yes, so the parking proposal will be no parking mandates for new construction, and appreciate your close read of our draft scope of work. So we are proposing creating a discretionary action. The exact type of discretionary action is still under development, but the idea is that we would create this action to remove existing parking under certain circumstances. So that action would require going through a review process, and one of the conditions for removing existing parking will be to facilitate adding more housing to that site. So that's still under development, but we don't anticipate existing parking will be dramatically affected through CHO.
Right. I just want to underscore the two different components of that. So like when you said lifting parking mandates for new construction, New York City is behind many other jurisdictions that have done this already, including places like Buffalo and Austin and jurisdictions in California. And we find that when those places lifted parking requirements, people still provide parking. They just provide as much parking as they think the residents of those apartment buildings will need. So in New York City, especially the farther away from mass transit you are, the more parking we expect developers to provide. And we see that today, where in some parts of the Eastern Bronx or some parts of South Brooklyn, developers actually provide more parking than is even required under the zoning today. So if they get built after this is enacted, they would build the exact same amount of parking there. We don't want to take any parking away from people who have it today. So if you have a parking spot at your co-op or whatever, we would not be eliminating parking requirements for those buildings automatically. If, say a development wanted to remove the parking requirements to do something else with the parking lot, there'll be a pathway to do that, but it'll require public review with environmental review as well. So we thought that was the best way to make sure that there was an opportunity for existing housing that wanted to get rid of its parking to do that without doing it automatically in a way that could, leave tenants out of parking spot or something like that. Thanks.
Thanks, John. So the next question is about accessory dwelling units, ADUs. It's kind of a logistics one. So wanting to understand, how do ADUs hook up into the city's sewer, water, electric systems? And there's a question about how is an ADU use for residential housing and not any commercial use?
Yeah, great question. Assuming that you're referring to how ADUs can be kept to be used just for housing purposes and not for short-term rentals. So existing laws regulating short-term rentals would also apply to ADUs, meaning an entire unit cannot be used for a short-term rental. And this is already being enforced by the Mayor's Office of Special Enforcement. As for the utilities question, hookups to utilities will vary by site and like ADU typology. For example, if the ADU is attached or detached. So homeowners will have to take into consideration the cost for their specific building and site and whether it makes financial sense for them to add an ADU. As part of our proposal development process, we've convened an interagency working group. And as part of that working group, we've also been thinking about a variety of homeowner assistance ideas based on best practices from other cities. This is another way that New York has been behind the curve from other cities across the country that have already done ADU programs. In some ways, we're thinking of helping homeowners who are interested in adding ADU include pre-approved ADU plans or a website of resources or a homeowner help desk.
And I just want to add one more thing too. HPD, Housing Preservation and Development, recently really opened applications for their +1 program that would provide financial assistance for homeowners who want to add an ADU. And I have to say, they were overwhelmed with applications from around the city. So this is just a pilot program, but it indicates strong interest from lots of folks across the city in creating an ADU program. And so we're excited to create a little more flexibility within the zoning for people who might need, a little more space for a family member or a little more income to cover living expenses.
Okay. The next one is specific to Community Board 8, which has a 197A plan, which downzones several neighborhoods according to the contextual zoning. Is there any impact on the 197A plan with this proposal?
So the City of Esther Housing Opportunity text amendment will not affect current regulations related to 197A plans. I don't know, John, if you want to add anything.
No, you're correct. Similar to, the effect of CHO on historic district regulations or something like that. We're not intending to interfere with any of those processes that exist outside the zoning.
And I think a similar question, there's a lot of questions about Bronx Metro North and its relationship to City of Yes, and will it impact, will there be an impact on the current Metro North zoning proposal? If you could speak a little bit about that. I'm going to tag team on this one.
Sure, I'm happy to take that one. So in anticipation of housing opportunity, we updated our proposal. So all the relevant provisions for City of Yes for housing opportunity are reflected in the current Metro North proposal.
Thank you very much. Okay, so going to go, there's a question about ZQA and MIH. For the 2016 zoning text change known as ZQA MIH, mandatory inclusionary housing in each council district, what was the expected build out in each council district for total housing units built for the next 15 years? And provide a projected build out breakdown in each council district by each of the proposed text changes. The third part of this question is provide the projected build out for the number of new housing units, but in each council district, sorry, it's cut off. As a result of the City of Economic Opportunity proposal. I will say, you know, this is for economic, City of Yes for housing opportunity. So if you have questions related to economic opportunity, we'll do our best here to answer them. But of course, please write to us and we can certainly answer those with other staff members. But if you have anything that you wanted to add, John or Winnie, just about mandatory housing, inclusionary housing or the ZQA aspect of that.
Sure. Yeah, I was around for zoning for quality and affordability in MIH back in 2015, 2016. I'll say that the environmental review for that one was actually purely prototypical analysis. Unlike for City of Yes for housing opportunity, we did not put numbers to particular parts of the city. We think of the environmental review for housing opportunity as just one example of the ways that we are, you know, evolving in the way that we do citywides in order to be more transparent and more informative. So like what he said, we'll be publishing a draft environmental impact statement in the next few weeks in a way that will put numbers to different geographies across the city. We're still working on that right now, so we don't have a final draft of that. Another way I want to point out that we've evolved since the MIH ZQA days is that we have, you know, Lara Marita and the division that she leads, community planning and engagement, which I think has enabled us to go out to way more people way earlier in the process than we were able to do back in 2015 and 2016. For any of you who were on community boards during the MIH and ZQA days, looking back, I think we really did, you know, a lot of the content of those proposals was a surprise shortly before it entered public review. And we are just trying to do everything we can for housing opportunity to make sure that that's not the case here, that every community board, every stakeholder who's interested has all the information they need in advance of public review to like hit the ground running.
Thank you, John. And this new team is very happy to be part of this. So the next question is probably a combination question. Chelsea, you may want to add to this one. How is City Council managing community board votes that are yes with conditions? In the Bronx during City of Yes for carbon neutrality, as well as economic opportunity, we saw a lot of those votes that were yes with conditions. Have City Council members reached out to community boards to discuss their conditions before the vote? Housing opportunity will go through the same process. So just want to know how this is being handled. I do want to say before, Chelsea, before you start, at least what happens with the resolutions is that they are put forward to the Planning Commission, who makes adjustments as seen fit to prepare to go to council. And then once it goes to the council holds another public hearing, but they have access to all of the information that has been in all the other three steps, which is the community board level, the borough president level, as well as the planning commission level. So there's recommendations that come through all of those different steps and hearings at each one. Then will be provided to the council, who will also hold their own public hearing and then move into a vote that may suggest some modifications to the text as well. So I don't know, Chelsea, if there's anything you wanted to add to that as part of that.
Thanks, Lara. Yeah, exactly what Lara said. But in addition to that, our division, which I think many people might not know, we're a team of planners, attorneys, and other staff that are constantly monitoring the public review process for any application that comes through our committees. And we help to prepare our council members with those questions, things that come up at the community board. We know as they come up at the community board, and we are ensuring that the council members who often are already familiar with the issues being brought up, that those are issues or ideas or, you know, ways that we could modify the proposal, which we frankly often do. I think the City Planning Commission with the zoning for economic opportunity text took a lot of the feedback and modified that proposal accordingly. And as Lara said as well, you know, those, as far as the economic opportunity proposal goes, which is moving ahead of this one, we will be having our public hearing next week on the 8th. That's starting at 10:30 in City Hall chambers. You can also sign up to testify on our website at the council.nyc.gov/land use. So we are constantly trying to get feedback and understanding what might be possible to help shape these proposals in a way that fits the needs of the community best.
Thank you. Okay, so this one might be a combination, Bronx and housing team. In the Bronx, there is a unique type of zoning called SNADs. That's particular within the western side of the Bronx. Can you explain how these new housing plans might affect SNADs determinations? While I support the creation of more affordable housing, I hope projects will not negatively affect what is left to the native nature and character of the borough. Paul, I don't know if you want to just describe SNADs a little bit, but also if we could talk through like how that will affect, be affected within this proposal.
Sure. So I mean, so the goal of that is to really protect some of the unique natural features in the northern part of the Bronx, and those requirements would not change. I think, and John and Winnie can add to that. Those requirements would not change, but I think what this provides is an opportunity for some of these very large parcels to create, you know, an ADU on site. So for example, you may need a mother-in-law unit, you may have children. So there's a benefit there for some of those homes that are located in the SNAD area.
Yeah, and I can say with respect to special districts, the Bronx has some, they exist all over the city. We looked at each one individually. Well, fundamentally, we believe in the housing opportunity proposals and want to carry them through the special districts to the extent we can. We are making modifications to the proposals to reflect the specific planning goals embedded in special districts. And of course, we expect that that'll be a big topic of conversation during public review as well, where, you know, community boards and city council member will have significant say and amount of control over, you know, the extent to which housing opportunity proposals carry through to special districts.
Great, thank you so much for that clarification. Okay, so I think this next question is geared towards the UAP portion of the proposal. The information that has been delivered between the City of Yass and the Metro North have been a little bit confusing. Wondering it would be much appreciated if the specs on both projects could be made clear, that it was stated that the City of Yass will have a 20% bump on top of what Metro North wants to implement. Would that mean there's additional stories than what is being proposed in the Metro North? And is there certain locations where, we have been told in certain locations, what does the City of Yass 20% bump look like? So particularly in the Metro North area, is there, we could talk through just like how will this impact that? And I think you touched on it earlier.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So again, so for example, a universal affordability preference, those increases, that's already been reflected in the Metro North proposal. So any of the districts that are affected, like if you look in the draft scope and what will be released, any of those districts that are already impacted through housing opportunity, those same numbers, increase in floor area ratio and heights, are reflected in the Metro North study.
And just want to underscore for the universal affordability preference framework, it is a voluntary framework. And so a developer can only take advantage of those higher FARs if they're building permanently affordable housing.
Yeah, I think that's pretty important to mark. And the importance of the Metro North study is that we're actually making mandatory inclusionary housing with development that's coming forward. So that's a big difference between doing a neighborhood plan where that MIH would take effect and doing a citywide where it's a voluntary action. Is there anything else that we want to add on to that?
Could I actually just ask a clarifying question? Because I see another question that's really related here. So if since the Metro North study is going, or the proposal is moving before the City of Yes proposal, does that mean that, like, how does that kind of coincide? Do those coincide with each other? Like, what happens if the city council does not vote for the City of Yes for housing? Does that impact the Bronx Metro North proposal?
Gotcha. No, that's a great question. Because Bronx Metro North represents a special district text, it can carry along in advance some of the modifications that are proposed as part of City of Yes. They can kind of mirror each other. And of course, both of those will go through City Council. And so, City Council will get to consider each of them in turn. But back to Paul's basic point, the proposals for housing opportunity are reflected in Metro North itself. So it's not the case that one will pass and then, a month later or whatever, new changes will come. What you see is what you get with respect to the Bronx Metro North.
Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, I think so. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like it's baked into the Bronx Metro North proposal and like that, because it's a little more, it's tailored to that unique community, right? So those proposals that would just affect a general zoning district in other parts of the city are really being baked into this proposal. So you're not going to see a major bump when the City of Yes comes in this particular area.
Right. And back to that basic point, that special districts afford community districts and council members a significant say and degree of control over to what extent housing opportunity gets carried through to those areas.
Thank you.
Okay. So the next question, hopefully you've had an opportunity, we may have to look this up, but I'm going to ask this. Hart Island, would you rate that as a high, medium, low density? And if you could just describe that a little bit, if you have that in front of you.
So
otherwise
yeah,
I can come back to that.
It's a really good illustration of the anachronism that is the 1961 zoning resolution. In 1961, Hart Island was rezoned with R6, which is a medium density district in its infinite wisdom. So, while it's city-owned property and that affords an extra layer of control over what happens or doesn't happen there, yes, it's kind of odd to note that it does have a zoning designation that would not be out of place in medium density parts of Queens or Brooklyn or the Bronx, even though it's Hart Island. So 1961 zoning, folks, part of the effort here is to try to update it for the modern era.
Great. Thank you, John. Okay, I'm going to go to an affordable housing question. What is your definition of affordable housing, and will that definition be written into the text?
Yeah, so this applies in a couple ways for housing opportunity, for the universal affordability preference for UAP, for affordability that looks like we're still working the exact AMI levels with our partners at Housing Preservation and Development. But we think we do a lot better than 80% AMI. We're also allowing for income averaging. So that's what affordability means for developments that want to take advantage of the higher FARs that are afforded through the UAP framework. As for the lower density proposals, when we talk about affordable housing, particularly for our missing middle housing proposals, such as our town center and our transit-oriented development, we're addressing how, like we mentioned, for those areas, the restrictive zoning have effectively kept those neighborhoods to produce primarily single-family homes, and home ownership is often a distant dream for a lot of New Yorkers, so it's arguably also the least affordable housing type. And we think by updating our zoning to make it less restrictive to allow for multifamily housing or two-family homes or ADUs in our low-density areas, we can allow for more naturally affordable housing in those neighborhoods, or allow for buildings to be built at a scale that can take advantage of existing affordability programs that HPD has on offer now.
Thank you. So this is a question going into the relationship between housing and parking, specifically in CB10, which is a auto ownership rate is upward of 80% allegedly. I'm not sure of that number, but it's a high ownership of cars. Having a car is needed in transit deserts. Rather than just eliminate all parking requirements, why not just allow construction to build upward so we can provide both housing and parking, so that we're not pitting against each other? So can we build taller so that we can provide housing and parking?
Yeah, definitely a great question. And we're really cognizant of how, particularly in our outer boroughs, where there's less access to public transit, how having a car is really important to meet your daily needs. But at the same time, we're recognizing how across the country, other localities have already eliminated their parking requirements because it's caused housing construction to become expensive. It increases the cost of housing construction to provide those parking spaces. So we recognize that reality that this is just one of those barriers to housing growth. So we think by just getting zoning out of the way of this, we can allow for more housing growth that the city really needs to meet our housing shortage. At the same time, though, when we look at areas in New York City where parking is already optional, we still see developers provide parking for some projects where they recognize there is still that need among residents. So we anticipate that developers will continue to provide parking where there is, that demand. And we imagine that will happen likely in parts of the Bronx where there is less access to transit.
Thank you. Okay, it's a long question, so just give me 1 second. On the stated project need, more housing is a purposely abstract and insufficient statement, as it ignores discrete categories of housing and also precludes attention to demographic research that may contribute to our housing crisis, such as rent burden, wasteful overbuilding in the luxury sector. Why aren't you identifying it? Are we identifying a particular housing need as MIH did? Are we very concerned that market rate development will once again, and as always, serve potentially wealthier and raise median rents unless the text amendment is scoped to purposely focus on a specific type of housing? Why not just add a UAP, for instance, to MIH? So the combination of the two.
Yeah, great question. So for New York City, like we touched on at the start of the presentation, there's such a historically low vacancy rate for rental units. Like we mentioned, 1.4% for the entire city. And for the Bronx, it's 0.8%. So frankly, that just speaks to how there's a need for more housing at every segment of the housing market. It's not just deeply affordable, also folks in the middle and higher income bands also need more housing. And for housing opportunity, more big picture, it's one of the reasons for why there hasn't been the housing to meet those needs at the various income levels is because zoning has been a barrier to the housing growth that we most desperately need. So frankly, it's hard to target one specific housing need because there is such a broad range of need at every range of the income level and for a variety of types of housing needs that frankly our zoning doesn't recognize. So that's also why parts of the proposal will facilitate more different types of housing, like small and shared, for instance, as well as tapping in more innovative housing solutions like converting underused non-residential buildings to housing. So we're just trying to unlock as much housing potential as we possibly can and just implementing different avenues for housing growth to meet the really desperate need for housing that the city currently faces.
Thanks, Winnie. So the next question is about lower density growth management areas. These proposals all look really great. How do these changes make it easier to build much needed housing, specifically in the lower density growth management areas, such as in Bronx Community District 10?
I can start by saying this is similar to what I said earlier about the way CHO interacts with special districts. We love the housing opportunity proposals. We, start from the perspective that we would love to carry them through to all special districts and special district-like zoning entities, such as lower density growth management areas. That said, we recognize that there are specific planning goals embedded in those special areas. So we're taking a look at each special district or special area individually to seeing what it makes sense to carry through and where it makes sense to give way to specific and essential planning goals there. So for instance, we will carry through our proposal to eliminate parking mandates for all new housing through lower density growth management areas. Do we think that means that when you build, a new one family or two family home in LDGMAs that they won't include parking? Of course not. They're, almost certainly going to provide parking. But for consistency with the citywide proposal and because we think it makes sense, that's where we'll start. There are other aspects of LDGMA that we're not touching. So we're still working on the specifics right now. But like we said, we hope to release draft text on even the special districts in advance of public review.
This next question is just asking to understand the small and shared apartments a little bit better. Is this similar to a single ring occupancy? If you could just describe the typology a little bit more.
Yeah, great question. So for the small and shared proposal, what we're doing is we're eliminating the dwelling unit factor in our transit zone. So the idea is that currently, because of the zoning regulation called the dwelling unit factor, buildings have to have a mix of unit sizes. So you have studios, but you have to balance them out with 2 bedrooms or 3 bedrooms, for instance. But we think that there's a market demand for buildings of just studio apartments, for instance. For if we think that if there's folks who want to live alone, who can't afford to do so, and who want to live in central areas, it'd be good for the zoning to allow for a building of just small, simple, no-frill studios. So that's what the small apartment aspect of that proposal is referring to. As for shared, that does include typologies like SROs, single room occupancies, but the idea is that shared housing is if you have your own bedroom, but you're sharing certain communal spaces, like a living room or kitchen space. And this is a proposal that we're working really closely with our partners at HPD with, because they've been exploring shared housing models as a way of producing affordable housing. At the same time, there's also demands on the other side of the housing market for like luxury shared housing models. So we think by updating our zoning, we can produce these types of housing types that currently are not allowed to serve different people's needs.
Great. This next question is around transit-oriented development. What's the radius around a subway in consideration for these for the TOD portion of the proposal?
Yes, and we just had an info session about our missing middle housing proposals. So if you're interested in greater detail on that, would recommend going to our website. So for the radius for what's considered within our transit-oriented development area is 0.5 miles from a subway station or rail.
Okay. See, okay. So this is a question about the vacancy rate that you mentioned. We are at a crisis level of only 1.4% vacancy rate. So does the vacancy rate include the 230,000 units that were vacant but not available for one or more reasons? According to the New York City housing vacancy survey? If not, how is New York City helping to make those available for rent? So this is getting to the point of the question of if there's vacancies in the units that are empty right now.
Yeah, so for that question, the vacancy rate, not positive if whether or not it includes those units, but I will note that, for example, there is HPD has looked into how many units that are vacant but can't be rented up, and it makes a very small portion of the total housing units available in New York City. We do recognize like any unit of housing is critical, and we want to make sure anything that is available to be rented can be made available and on the market. But broadly speaking, from like a long-term perspective, we're looking for New York City's future. Even if every unit currently is made available and rented, we still need more housing to meet future population growth as people's children grow up and like want to move out. When people come to the city for jobs, like we still need to produce the housing to meet future need as well. And that's why we're making these zoning updates so that we have a framework available for long-term future of making sure there's enough housing to meet current as well as future New Yorkers' needs.
Thank you. This is about home ownership. So will these housing developments take advantage of the Housing Preservation Department's home ownership programs? Is that a possibility?
Yes, we're very excited to be working with HPD on ways to facilitate affordable home ownership, which has received a dramatic amount of attention, especially in recent years, from members of the current city council. And so we propose to make certain adjustments to make affordable home ownership work better with existing affordable housing programs in the zoning. Like there are some obstacles, for instance, in the MIH program that have gotten in the way of affordable home ownership in some instances we're addressing. And then with our missing middle proposals, we're very excited. I mean, missing middle represents modest multifamily housing, 6, 8, 12, 15 units in that vicinity. That's pretty small if you're talking about HPD subsidized affordable rentals, but it's a sweet spot for certain HPD affordable home ownership programs. And so we with our partners at HPD have been looking forward to making that more possible in parts of the city that does not see a ton of subsidized affordable housing today.
Thank you. The next question is, when will the DEIS or the EIS, the environmental impact statement, be issued? That is issued when we go into public review. So you will see it as soon as possible when we refer the package. That will be up on our website and available within the community board package. I go down, hold on, here we are. You mentioned this before, but I feel like it's a question that's coming up a lot in these chats. It's just, will you eliminate special district zonings or landmark districts? If you could just talk a little bit about that process.
Totally. First off, landmark designations and historic districts. I was sitting next to Mark Silverman, the general counsel of LPC, when this question came up on a panel recently, and he was able to answer in half a sentence, which is no, changes to the zoning won't in any way affect LPC review within historic districts or proposed changes to individual landmarks. So that'll remain exactly the same. It exists outside the zoning, and we couldn't touch it even if we wanted to. Next, with respect to special districts, we are looking at each one individually, each special district individually. We're starting from a point of, we want to carry through our housing opportunity proposals to all special districts. That said, in instances where housing opportunity proposals may conflict with specific planning goals that are embedded in those special districts, then we will adjust our proposals as well. And it works a little bit differently in every special district, and we fully expect that to be a topic of conversation during public review and when housing opportunity gets to city council.
Thank you, John. This one is also talking about boundaries. It's about transit-oriented development boundaries. Can criteria for TOD boundaries, transit-oriented development, change going forward? May new lines be developed? What is kind of the process about thinking about that?
Yeah, so housing opportunity is a text amendment. So the text will define the transit geography shape as 0.5 miles from subway or a rail station. So as new subway or rail stations come online, low density districts that are 0.5 miles away from those new stations also qualify for the TOD proposals.
Thank you. Okay, so this one is about affordable housing co-ops again, or about affordable housing. I live in a affordable housing co-op that has several buildings, all of them 50 years old and older. The city and the state is building new housing and not doing anything to spend on helping to fix up affordable housing. Affordable housing can have additional housing much faster than building new housing. So there's not exactly a question in there, but I think it's just really talking about like the difference between maintenance of existing housing and building of new housing.
I can add a few things there,
Okay.
just because this is a topic of conversation with our partners at HPD along a few dimensions. For instance, the Universal Affordability Preference program will enable, in some instances, existing affordable housing to count towards that higher FAR that's allotted to affordable housing. In order to do that, that housing will be, in essence, preserved by extending regulatory agreements and ensuring that work is put into that housing in order to maintain it for the future. I'd also point out that our campus infill proposals in many instances create opportunities for existing campuses, whether it's Mitchell Lamas or NYCHA campuses, or I'm doing this from Hillman Housing down on the Lower East Side, which is a limited dividend housing corporation campus, will in many instances give developments like that the opportunity to do new things with their land in a way that can help preserve the existing units elsewhere on the campus. And so, it's just one of the ways that we're hoping that our housing opportunity proposals provide opportunities for, existing residents and new folks coming to the city in the future.
And just to add, this is just one tool in the toolkit to address our housing crisis. We are city planning, we're focused on the zoning and the land use, but we are still working with our partners at HPD who do the good work of preserving affordable housing and financing new construction of affordable housing. So this is a multi-pronged, effort among many agencies for how we can do our part to actually address the housing crisis.
Thank you. So the next question is about specifically Morris Park in Baychester. What is the estimated time for construction to begin in that area? How can we view a map again of the areas of under construction consideration? So this is a question geared towards Bronx Metro North that is not the reason why we're here today, but I thought it'd be important just to remind people of when construction is happening for the Metro North rail station that is opening that we're very excited about, and then that there's a process with public hearings that are happening within the Bronx Metro North proposal.
Yeah, so for the stations themselves, as far as the estimated time for the stations to come online is 2027. And then in terms of any construction, once this is adopted, all the land is privately owned. So once the proposal is adopted and becomes law, which we anticipate would be in August or September of this year, then people will be able to be able to build as of right. And then in terms of being able to see maps as part of the proposal, we can certainly send a link. But if they go on the portal, where we on the ZAP portal, they'll be able to see the entire proposal, including existing and proposed maps for zoning. And we can send them that link.
Okay, thank you. John, Winnie, if you could just say again the difference between the UAP bonus and the MIH bonus. Is it that the UAP bonus is an addition to the MIH bonus, or are they two separate bonuses?
Here's how I think of it. It's that UAP, for the first time, extends an inclusionary framework everywhere in medium and high density districts, all R6 to R10, except areas that are mapped with mandatory inclusionary housing. Like Winnie said, UAP is a voluntary framework that enables you to build a little bit bigger as long as you provide permanently affordable housing. MIH, on the other hand, is mandatory affordability requirements. If you build any housing at all, you are obligated to provide a percentage of affordable housing as part of that development. And that's available in areas of the city that, like Bronx Metro North, are rezoned for significantly more residential capacity. That, MIH ensures that if you're significantly increasing residential capacity, then the new development that happens there is affordable to families at a range of incomes. Outside of MIH areas, CHO, like we've described, it's just a little bit more. It's not 50%, 100% increase in density. It's a little bit more in a way that isn't appropriate for affordability mandates. For UAP, however, we're saying, okay, you get the zoning you get today, your market rate cap remains where it is, but we're just floating affordable and supportive FARs a little bit higher. You can take advantage of that, but only if you provide affordable and supportive FAR. So that's the difference.
Thank you. Okay. So, there's a question about what do you mean the difference between public review? Isn't that ULURP? I will do my best, but they're different. Actually, I don't know if somebody else wants to take this one. I don't want to screw it up, more confusing.
If you go to the city charter and you look at section 197 of the city charter, you'll see the ULURP that we know and love laid out there. 60 days, 60 days of community boards, borough presidents, 60 days at city planning commission, 50 days of council. It lays out, however, a slightly different process for text amendments to the zoning resolution, where it looks very much the same, but the timetables aren't exactly the same, and it gives additional allowances to like the city planning commission to hold text amendments indefinitely. You can kind of ignore all that, because for text amendment processes like these, we basically follow the ULURP clock. We go to the CBs for 60 days. The borough president gets a look to, or the borough boards if they want. It goes to the commission for 60 days. It goes to council for 50 days. If they modify, then there's an extra 15 days on that period. So even at city planning where we're supposed to know all this stuff inside and out, we often frequently refer to the text amendment process as ULURP, and then somebody will inevitably pipe up and say it's not ULURP, it's text amendment. But for all intents and purposes, it's basically the same thing in terms of public review.
Thank you. So the next question will be, sorry, I'm just trying to find the spot again. Okay, so this one is based on the City Island Special District particularly. The so-called exclusionary zoning was done purposely to maintain the charm and uniqueness of these neighborhoods. How does the City of Yes proposal impact the City Island Special District zoning? I'm not sure if you've had an opportunity to look at that specific district. If not, we can certainly get back, but I just wanted to make sure that we'd said that question.
Right. I mean, I've said how City of Yes for Housing Opportunity interacts with special districts a couple times before. A slightly different way to answer this question too is that, when we say we want to enable a little more housing everywhere, we really mean that we want to enable a little more housing everywhere, and that no place is completely off limits. And while we definitely give way to specific planning goals embedded in special districts, that doesn't mean that they are completely, opting out or completely, don't have to do anything. And I've said the same thing. I was on a panel at the Historic Districts Council event a couple weeks ago, and saying the same thing to folks who are big supporters of historic districts. Just because you're a historic district, doesn't necessarily mean that you can't build any new housing there at any point ever in the future. It means that it's a more sensitive context, certainly. It means that you have to be careful to preserve what makes that historic district or that special district like City Island special. But we totally believe that it's also possible to create a little new housing in those places while maintaining what keeps them special. One of the things I love about the housing opportunity proposals is the extent to which they look to New York City's past for building types that have worked in the past, that we made illegal in 1961, or we made illegal in the 1980s, or we made illegal in the early 00s, and trying to re-legalize them. So like the slide that Winnie showed on town center zoning, a couple stories of residential above a commercial ground floor, there are parts of City Island where that will fit in really nicely. And that's, just one example of the way we look to New York City's past to re-legalize building forms that people know, that people like, that can provide additional housing while totally fitting in with the existing neighborhood character.
Thank you, John. So now I'll be going to a question about accessory dwelling units. Can current extensions of a home that used to be used for long-term renting before local law 18 now be classified as an ADU? Or must that single-family home now do renovations on the house before the area now extended is considered an ADU? This might be one we get back. Take it back, or... So it's basically saying if you have an extension on your home already that was long-term renting previously and is not currently, is there a way to bring that into compliance to make it an ADU now?
Right. I mean, we do believe the ADU regulations that we'll propose, will have a size limit on them, no more than 800 square feet. It'll have, certain allowances for height and setback attached to them. If an existing space within an existing building can comply with the different criteria to be an ADU, then you could create an ADU out of a portion of an existing dwelling. So it all depends on whether you can qualify for the criteria that necessary to be an ADU. Are you a 1 or 2 family home? Is your ADU limited to 800 square feet or less? Is it within the footprint of an existing building, for instance? Does it comply with the yard regs and other height and setback regs? If so, then yes, you could classify a portion of an existing building as an ADU. I can't speak to whether this particular instance that would be possible here, but theoretically it is possible.
Thank you. So I just want to recognize that it is 8:17. We have a few minutes left. We have gotten to a lot of the questions that have been asked so far. We'll try to get to a few more. But as you can see, that a note was dropped that if you do have additional comments or questions after the session has ended, you can please email us at dcpcityofyes_dl@planning.nyc.gov. And again, we'll be having another info session coming up that we hope that many of you will be able to attend. And then when public review starts, we hope to see you all through that process. So let me see. I just want to see if there's any topics that we haven't gotten to yet that could be helpful. Let's see. Not a ton left, but so How about we go to a question about just data in general. According to the US Census, the city has lost 540,000 residents since April 2020. We need to check that number. How do you use data when you're thinking about these proposals?
Thanks for that question. So in city planning, I sit next to the director of the population division, which handles all the census process for New York City. And they are taking a very careful look at this question. In fact, that believe that any sort of population losses post-COVID have been greatly exaggerated. Maybe we haven't lost population at all. So we're continuing to look into that, and we'll have more information soon. That said, some people ask, well, if population is declining, like why are we seeing such a tight housing market? Why are we seeing rents go up as much as they are? And as best as we can tell, the short answer to that question is that in the post-COVID era, people are consuming more housing. It's a lot of people are working from home. People who can often have 2 bedrooms, one of which is a home office rather than, someplace where they have a roommate, for instance. And even if a few people, consume a little more housing, that can have a ripple effect through the housing market that creates to that like historically tight market that Winnie was referring to, that 1.41 net rental vacancy rate. And, I think of the data and the statistics that are closest to the work we do as things like, what are rents doing? What's the vacancy rate? Do tenants have any options on the housing market today? Or, are they forced into situations where landlords have all the power? And so, I don't think things like, what percentage of New York City renters are rent burdened? How many are paying more than 30% of their income? How many are paying more than 50% of their income? So I consider those to be the data that we look at most closely. And all of those point in the same direction, which is that we have a historically brutal housing shortage. And if we don't find a way to enable significantly more housing in areas across the city, then we're looking at a lot of human misery, high rents, displacement, gentrification pressure, overcrowding, homelessness for the foreseeable future. And so, yes, we look very, very closely at data. Everything we look at points in the same direction, which is we desperately need to do something about our housing shortage. We think a proposal that takes as wide a possible scope as we can, that operates citywide, is the best approach to create a significant amount of new housing without affecting neighborhood character or without overtaxing infrastructure in any one place. So that's why we stand behind these proposals.
Yeah, and I would also add to that, we have Paul here from the Bronx office at the Department of City Planning. And he hears his team hears from you all every day on your lived experience. So using the data that we collect through the many different data sources, such as the census that was mentioned here, we also hear every day from New Yorkers what they're experiencing and how hard it is to continue to rent or to own in the city. So those 2 components really help us think about how we can make every neighborhood accessible and provide options to all of us New Yorkers. Okay, so I'm gonna think we have time for like one more question, possibly 2 dependent, possibly. Please clarify what this MIH expansion refers to in context of the UAP discussion. So again, MIH, mandatory inclusionary housing, refers to in the context of UAP, which is the universal affordability preference that's in the proposal. Does it make City of Yes a ULURP? does it apply to the Bronx? And there's a specific quote that's pulled out of a initiative news initiative newspaper off of the off of the mayor's website. By creating new high-density residential zoning districts with mandatory inclusionary housing, New York City will be ready to act as soon as Albany lifts this FAR cap. Can you explain a little bit about the FAR cap and then, if that's applicable to the Bronx?
Gotcha. Okay. I see where this question's coming from. The deputy mayor made a speech earlier this week or last week where she announced that the housing opportunity proposals would create a couple new zoning districts, one at 15 FAR, another at 18 FAR. Those would be mandatory inclusionary housing districts where if they were mapped, any residential construction in those districts would have to provide a percentage of permanently affordable housing. Many of you might be saying, wait, how can you have a 15 FAR district or an 18 FAR district? There's a state law that's been in place again since 1961 that says no zoning district can go above 12 FAR of residential. That's the state cap that it's being referred to. For a number of years now, we in the city have advocated to the state to lift the cap. Why would we want the state to lift the cap? Because we want to be able to create more housing in some of the most central parts of the city that have the best access to jobs and transit. We want to be able to apply affordable housing obligations in those areas. And if those areas are already zoned up against the cap, 12 FAR, we can't do that. We're prohibited from doing that under state law. And, we as planners think that the best place to include new housing, the best place to include new affordable housing are in those central locations with great access to jobs and transit, amenities, opportunities. So we are advocating for the state to lift the cap. Is it a way to give them a little nudge to say, hey, we're serious. If you lift the cap, we want to apply affordable housing mandates there. We've created those new zoning districts I mentioned. They will have no applicability whatsoever until such time as the city planning goes through ULURP to map them in particular parts of the city. We haven't looked at any particular neighborhoods yet because we're not allowed. The cap is still in place, and we're not sure whether the state will lift it. If the state lifts it, then we'll start looking at different areas where going above 12 FAR might make sense. But we have not looked at any, named any of those specific places yet or looked at them seriously since the cap is still in place. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, John. That was really helpful to understand the difference. So we are at 8:27. So getting very close to the end. I don't know, Chelsea, if I should kick it over to you and if you wanted to close out. But I do want to at least thank everybody and remind you can continue to send questions to DCP City of Yes, all one word, _DL@planning.nyc.gov. And a reminder that you can find on the website that CHO info session will be on, City of Yes Housing Opportunity info session will be next Wednesday, in 2 weeks, April 17th at 6:30. I'll hand it back over to you, Chelsea.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I just wanted to say a couple of things. New Yorkers deserve more housing options, and I think that's something we can all agree on. We disagree on a lot in the city, but I think people are feeling this housing crisis in many different ways. And as Winnie had said earlier, this is just one tool we have to address this complex issue. Having been at the council for the better part of the last decade, we often modify applications. So I can comfortably say, I think, this will probably change through public review based on the input that we get at sessions like this, through hearings at the community boards, borough president, borough boards. I mean, there's tons of opportunities to continue to weigh in. So I just really encourage everyone to really thoughtfully think about the nuances of this proposal rather than clinging on to the rhetoric to reject it outright. And just continue to engage in this process. And, you know, to address this crisis, this will require action not only from the city, but also from the state and federal government. At the city council, we are committed to addressing the housing crisis and will continue to do so. We've expanded the city FEPS program to enable more individuals and families to access vouchers. We passed the Fair Housing Framework to establish housing targets for each local community district. And Speaker Adams once again committed to addressing the housing crisis in her recent State of the City address, including supporting housing production, deepening housing affordability, and strengthening homeownership. I saw a lot about office conversions. The city has active proposals to address that as well. So yeah, with that, I will just want to thank everyone. DCP did a fantastic job. Once again, we really appreciate your partnership here. Thank you to the Bronx delegation, especially the co-chairs, Councilmember Stevens and Dinowitz. Our zoning of the subcommittee and zoning and franchises, Councilmember Riley, Chair of Land Use, Councilmember Salamanca. We also had here tonight representation from our Community Engagement Division, our Planning and Land Use Division, who are continue to listen to this. Majority Leader Farias was on. Councilmember Marmorato stayed for the entire session tonight. We had representation from Borough President Gibson's office, Councilmember Sanchez's office, community boards across the Bronx, as well as community-based organizations and representation from our Housing Preservation and Development Department. So thank you so much, and please continue to stay engaged on this as we move forward to address this critical issue in our city.
Thank you for having us.